So what's really good about this award is that it's for a community, and I'm happy to be here to accept it on behalf of that community. In the process of the next few minutes, to tell you a little bit more about what we've been up to since the first edition of this book was published in 2011, as we said, 2020, and now the recent version of 2026. In case you don't know them, there's a picture of Steve, who's recovering from heart surgery, so we pass on his wishes to him, and Michael, who's caught up in being head of school in Australia, Australian National University. It's a bit of a toss-up. Which of those two things is the more arduous thing? But I think we'll probably answer from Steve, but he's doing well, which is good. He's very sorry, they're both very sorry that they weren't here. But I have, it says something about two partage, two votra, I'm not entirely sure what that's relates to. I don't know if it's anything to lose at all. It could be good to lose that. Anyway. So what we'll be talking about, I was originally told if I had 15 minutes or so, we're going to have to really cram that in. And then they said, well, we've got half an hour. So the good news is, I'm not going to cram it in. The bad news is 15 minutes long. But anyway, I'll take the time. Whenever I or we talk about leadership, I always start by defining what it is that we're talking about. Because you can talk to people for a long time about what you think is leadership, you actually discover they're talking about something else, what leaders do, and a lot of the time what leaders do is not leadership. It's moved. Okay. Now it's not working at all. Hello? It's not moving at all. So it's not before. That's what's technically known as a charge. Okay. It's the emergency feed. I have got a clicker in my, while we're waiting, I would never travel nowadays without a clicker. It's just the thing. It's part of the survival kit, like passport. Solve the problem. Have we got it? And we haven't, there isn't any accident. I couldn't find a clicker, so that was a lockdown too. Okay, here we are. Right. So, what is leadership? Leadership is the process whereby one or more members of a group influence other group members in a way that motivates them to contribute to the achievement of group goals. That's a very uncontroversial definition, thank you very much, from the social and that is followership, which we're going to talk a lot more about. So, the key thing to take away from that definition is that leadership is not just about leaders, it's also about followers. The title of one of Michael's talks is There is no leadership without followership. Leadership is always proved by the followership of others, and if other people don't follow, there is no leadership to talk of. And that's really a critical thing. Following on from that then, is that leadership is about something that binds leaders and followers to each other. It's not just about them as individuals, it's about them as members of a common group. And critically, what we're talking about here is a group process. And this is a point of John Turner, a mentor of ours, and someone who contributed deeply to the ideas behind the book. It's a power process, but it's not about power over, it's about power through. Everybody who's here and everybody who's at this conference is not here because the leadership have power over them and told them if you didn't turn up, something bad would happen to you. They consume power through because you want to be part of this movement, of this collective. You want to be part of this community and live out that group membership. So where does it all go wrong is the kind of question. Where do tradition, with the sort of audacious, when we first come up with the title of the book, The New Psychology of Leadership, it's a little bit audacious, like what we've been around for a long time and we need a new psychology. Do we? Well, the answer is really yes, because this is a topic that psychologists and other people keep getting wrong. Where do they go wrong? Where do traditional approaches to leadership go wrong? Firstly, they just focus on leaders, overlooking followers. They see leadership as a quality that a leader will have and that will be recognized by everyone, rather than something that's grounded in group membership and group life. And finally, when we're talking about the psychology of leadership, it's pretty much written in the first person singular, focusing on leaders as the great I. There's no reference to the we and the us of leadership. And yet, this is a quote from the leadership scholar John Adair, the least important word in the leader's vocabulary is I, and the most important word is we. And now we have the research in all manner of domains that absolutely proves the empirical truth of that statement. So why then is psychology and pretty much everything else around leadership fixated on the I of it and not the we of it? And really, in very simple terms, our work is about putting the we back into leadership. But standing in our way is the kind of received practice around leadership. These ideas that I talked about that refuse to die, and that we have talked about as we could refer to as zombie leadership. And there's a set of sort of axioms of zombie leadership. We talk about the idea that, leadership's only for leaders. Leaders have special qualities that differentiate them from everybody else, that all leadership is the same, and so on and so forth. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those. And one of the consequences of people embracing these kind of ideas is that in all manner of communities where we're looking for people to do leadership in a way that might mobilize people, that outline the definition at the start, what you see is actually leaders who alienate people and fail to take them with them and end up just exercising power over them. And we refer to those as kind of zombie leaders, and they look something like this. And increasingly, I think you see around the world in all manner of domains, whether you're talking about sport or business or higher education for that matter, you see that people at the top are zombie leaders, not people who are actually doing leadership in the manner that we might want them to on behalf of us. And again, to kind of bring that to life, we developed a kind of game, and I'm going to use that to illustrate some of the points I'm making today, and I'm going to talk about that more in my poster tomorrow if you want to come on and find out more about it. So what do we have to say? What's the kind of core thesis of this work? It is relatively straightforward. Firstly, that effective leaders embody a social identity, a sense of we-ness that they share with other group members, and they exert influence on this basis. If I or the executive have any influence over you in this context, it's everything to do with our identity as members of this community. If I was talking to a conference of electricians or conservative politicians or whatever it might be, I would have no impact on them because there would be no shared identity, no basis for shared identity. And it would all potentially go horribly wrong. Okay. And again, lots of leadership does precisely because it's not respectful of or grounded in shared identity. What we argue then, elaborating on that point, is that leadership can be understood as a process of social identity management that centers on leaders' ability to create, advance, represent, and embed a shared special sense of us. Again, conferences like this and events like this are all about celebrating and building that sense of shared identity, that sense of community. And they center on this process that we refer to as identity leadership. And actually, there's already been several talks at this conference on this. There's a couple of sessions, a couple of symposia later in the conference. So there's a lot of stuff now within the sort of breadth and depth of this community. It's exploring the implications of that core observation. But in the book, as noted, there are kind of four core claims. That leadership is about being one of us, what we call identity procyclicality. It's about doing it for us, identity advancement. It's about creating a sense of us or crafting a sense of us, what we refer to as identity entrepreneurship. And finally, it's about making us matter, or what we refer to as identity impresarieship. And I'm just going to unpack those four elements very quickly just to give you a feel for what they kind of entail. Although looking around the audience, I think most of you would have a pretty good understanding of this already because you're either doing work on this topic or something that's pretty adjacent to it. Being one of us, that's the original executive committee of the EASP. That isn't what we look like now, but that's what they look like then, and that's what you needed to look like to do leadership, okay? It probably isn't going to work today, which again tells you something important about leadership, that they did leadership for their group in that time, and they were effective and influential. We're all here in a sense because of them, because they represented an emergent identity that members of this community shared at that time. And they stood for the shared values and principles and goals of that entity, that organisation. They were seen as one of us, not as one of them, and as embodying who we are and what we wanted to be as social psychologists, as European social psychologists. Just to capture that in a scale, this is a scale developed by our close colleague Nick Steffens, the Identity Leadership Inventory. I'll tell you a little bit more about it as we go on. That's captured by a very simple item, something in the format, this leader is a model member of my group. And in another study led by Nick, a meta-analysis of all of the studies that interrogate that hypothesis, there's a lot of them, there they all are. What you see is that all of the effects are to the right-hand side of that red line. In other words, it's very hard to do leadership if you're not seen as one of us. If you're seen as one of them, that is a barrier to you having any influence. And in the context of the leadership literature, that's a massive effect. The effect size associated with things like intelligence is around about 1.17, and that's the best individual level variable out there, and that's what a lot of people talk about, creative intelligence or practical intelligence, emotional intelligence. The best that's going to give you, when you square that, is about 20% of the variance that identity leadership is explaining. But leadership isn't just about standing for the group, it's also about standing up for it. So leaders need to be in-group champions. They need to be perceived to stand up for an identity that we share and to be doing it for us, again, not doing it for them. You are a spokesperson for us. You're not here as a stooge of some alien out-group who's visiting us to subject us to some form of tyranny on behalf of this other set of objectives. Okay, I'm describing university life. Okay, so again, what we're saying is this leader is a champion of my group. Again, when I want to illustrate this, I think a really good illustration, one of the best, comes from this speech by Queen Elizabeth I. Yeah, she's a really old woman, so but a lot of you would know who she is, but maybe you didn't have Kate Blanchett. She's a kind of modern instantiation of her in the film, and the film ends with this, Elizabeth's golden speech of November the 30th, 1601, sometimes said to be the most important speech in the English language ever given in terms of its political implications for Britain and for its relationship with other countries and so on, and galvanising in particular what had hitherto been a divided nation, divided along lines of religion. Elizabeth unified that through her ability to do identity championing. And what she said in that speech was, of myself, I must say this. I never was any greedy, scraping grasper, nor yet a waster. My heart was never set on worldly goods, but only for my subjects' good. And though you have had, and may have many mightier and wiser princes in this seat, yet you never had, nor shall have, any that love you better. Okay, that's the beat. Okay, that's what she said, okay? And that's what she did. That's why she's a leader. That's why we celebrate her. Because everything she did was for us, okay? And that's the bottom of it, okay? And again, if you think that leadership is all about me, that's a problem, okay? It's lived out through people who show their commitment to the group. But what if there isn't a group to represent? What if you're just herding cats, okay? Well, this is really the work of Steve and Nick Hopkins. What they argue is that leaders need to work hard to build and convey a sense of us. They also need to craft identity to ensure that they and their vision are prototypical for the group. And lots of times leaders come from a position of disadvantage. They might be a woman in a sexist organisation, or they might be someone who's old in an ageist community group, or and. Okay. So, prototypicality is not a given. It's something that you need to work with as a leader and make a case for through your own actions. And a key way in which you do that is to create a sense of cohesion within your group. As Nirek said, a lot of the work that we did as a group, and Yolanda and Tegan over here, and Kath and many others, we looked at the role of social identity in the pandemic, and it's very clear, and there's lots of studies on this, that identity leadership was absolutely critical to an effective response. There's lots of studies on this. One led by Svenja Fransford, who's here in the audience somewhere, I saw her earlier, who was just looking at this in many different countries. And what she saw was that identity leadership was a good predictor of adherence to health directives. And what was that identity leadership focused on? It was focused on cultivating and locking in a sense of shared national identity. And leaders who weren't able to do that or didn't care about doing it actually were less successful in securing adherence to those goals and those objectives and those directives. But critically, and this is an incredibly important point, I think, in the context of psychological discussion of leadership. Leadership isn't just about talking the talk of identity. It's about walking the walk, and more particularly helping others to walk the walk. And what we argue is that leaders don't just, as it were, invoke the idea of us. They create structures that give us a material reality. They do things like organising activities and events and festivals and rituals and celebrations and buildings and conferences like this, again, that make our identity something real and physical. And it's the fact that we live out our identity as European social psychologists in this context that is, in a way, makes what's going on here leadership, but also is critical to mobilising us to act in the name of that collective, to do European social psychology, and to be keen to do it, and to forge connections and to make a difference in the world. And again, that ensures that the rhetoric of us is translated into group members' lived experience. That's an important point to remember in the context of a world where people say, what's the point of an academic conference? You can do it all online, it costs a lot of money. The executives don't say that when they're flying off on their junkets, by the way. But still, the reality is these conferences are important because we actually have the visceral experience of identity. And actually, a key point, I think, in a lot of psychological research is we kind of lose touch with the material aspects of identity and indeed of psychological processes. This leader creates structures that are useful for my group. But in that context, so far, I've been talking rather like your average organisational managerial psychologist. I'm giving you the idea that everything in the garden of leadership is kind of good, and this is a lovely-dovey kind of experience that you're going to have under the thrall or in the thrall of these identity leaders. But a key point is identity leadership is only as good as the content of the identities that leadership embraces. I've talked about leadership efficacy, are leaders effective? But also, we just have to open a history book and see that a lot of leaders have done identity leadership in the cause of doing ethnographic studies of Trump rallies. And at that point, it was clear to us that one of the reasons why Donald Trump was such a potent political force is because he was a very potent impresario of identity in the way that the Democrats absolutely weren't and probably still aren't. And if you are wanting them to win, that's a huge problem. Okay. If you can't create structures that allow your group members to feel positive about us and to be mobilised in our name, you're going to struggle to get their support as a leader. Okay. Moving to conclusion then. So again, there's implied in a lot of things I talk, is a fairly sort of narrow band of activity that relates to what we might call leadership. And again, you might say, well, all of this research has been done in sort of Western type affluent sort of industrialized context. And that is true, a lot of it has. But actually, thanks to a really huge team of researchers, and again, many of whom are here, we've actually explored these ideas, led by Rolf van Dijk and his team at Goethe University in Frankfurt, who've been working on this, the Identity Leadership Development Project. We've now administered the ILI to over 7,000 workers in 28 countries and 19 languages. And the bottom line there is that identity leadership explains variance in team identification, performance, innovation, and health, and that's a whole other story there too, over and above all other recognised measures. So this really has a bite, and if you're not, again, doing identity leadership, wherever you are, you're unlikely to get the buy and the followership that you need in order to succeed. And importantly too, this isn't just about geography. It's also about domain. And as was alluded to at the start, work now has been done on identity leadership, and a whole raft of topics, issues and fields. So it's applied psychology, social psychology, obviously management, multidisciplinary stuff in the military, in extremism, crisis management, in hospitality, in sport, in political science, in education, in religion, in business, in economics, in clinical and health psychology, in environmental psychology, in engineering, in psychiatry and so on. And in each of the, I could again, or someone else more fittingly in the audience, could give a talk on any one of these boxes and talk about the importance of identity leadership for these different domains. A couple I picked out, a lot of work on in the health domain and the idea that therapy is in a particular sense identity leadership, work by Alicia Robertson, Tegan Cruz. Also, the idea that education and teachers are doing identity leadership. Great work by Kate Reynolds and others showing that effective leadership, getting students motivated, but also getting them to perform in educational context, is all about identity leadership. We have some big projects on that. There's also a great book about the leadership of Vladimir Putin, and really shows that actually someone who really has taken those messages to heart in the way that they have exercised power and achieved that is Putin. But again, all of those things are very interesting. One final one I want to really bring it back to core social psychological concerns is that we argue that identity leadership is a core feature of many of the classic studies in social psychology. And indeed, you can see that it's actually central to psychology experiments in general. That's a book that we recently explored in, or have for many years now. It's the third edition of this book, led by Joanne Smith, looking at those classic studies in organisation, in social psychology. Things like Sharif Boys Camp studies, Milgram's obedience studies, Zimbardo's prison experiments. What you see is that in all of those studies, the experimenters created demands of some form that they wanted the participants to work towards. So they, if you like, wanted to engender particular forms of followership on the part of the studies. So if in that context, in the context of experiments, you can think that experimenter effects, so we often talk about as some sort of methodological artifact, are actually reflections of experimenters' motivation to do identity leadership that encourages participants to show the engaged followership that produces the desired outcomes, the effects that the experimenters were looking for. Again, Sharif, Milgram, Violet, and so on. And what you see, though, is that that identity leadership, that motivation, is typically absent from attempted replications. In particular, it was absent from the work that Steve and I did on the BBC prison study, which revisited the Stanford prison experiment, but did not do the sort of identity leadership that Zimbardo did. And as a result, we got very different findings. And there's also critiques of all these studies that say, oh, there was methodological problems. Well, really, the issue is that the people who did the replications weren't doing the identity leadership, but also there's a problem that when people were talking about those methodologies, they didn't reflect, as experimenters, on the work that they were doing. And to the extent that they did at any point, they actually later excised it from formal accounts. So what we argue, is that if you're looking at leadership in the world at large, and in particular, we're talking about an $80 billion a year industry. An $80 billion a year, that's a massive industry. But that is very much dictated and governed and directed by what I refer to as zombie leadership. There's ideas that are well past their use-by date. As a kind of like, again, if I kind of imagine that there might be quite a few people that find it a little bit bored, either because they've heard it all before or they've just come to the wrong tour, or they're desperate for a drink, or they're trying to get away from England losing to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is, you know, yeah. What's it called? Oh, is it? Okay, well, there you go. That's a victory for identity leadership. Which is an interesting story in itself. But again, Neville Southall in particular was really hot on these kinds of issues and inspired by some of the work of people in this room, I think did actually transform the way that players in England related to their manager and what the manager was trying to do with the team and actually what he was doing with his identity leadership. But another story. Okay, an aside. So if you want to do an exercise, what this exercise does, if you do that QR code, you probably can't see it back, but is it asks you to evaluate the identity leadership and the leader identity of the worst leader that you've ever encountered in your life and the best leader. And you can do it afterwards if you want to, don't do it all. But this is what the data's going to look like, and we know because we've done a lot of a lot of people already. The best leaders look like this. That's identity leadership on the y-axis, so they're high in identity leadership, and they have a mix of leader identity. So that's, do they think of themselves as a leader? Some do, some don't, okay? If you look at the worst leaders, they have very low identity leadership, but they actually all have a very strong sense of leader identity, largely because the companies or the organizations they work for have invested billions of dollars in them developing that identity. But actually, where does it get them? Precisely nowhere, okay? So identity leadership is diagnostic of success. Leader identity is actually diagnostic of failure. Again, then why is it that as a societies, we're throwing so much money at a model that doesn't work? That's a huge issue for us to address politically, and I just put it out there as something to take back to the next leadership course that you're forced to go on. Okay. Last slide. 70 years ago, 1950s and 60s, leadership was a core topic in social psychology. If you look at Lorene's work, Cartwright's work, Alport's work, Sharif's work, they all reflected extensively on the role of leadership in the processes they were studying. An interesting little aside is in the first edition of The Nature of Prejudice, there was a chapter on leadership. By the time you got to the second edition, that chapter had been removed. And that tells you kind of everything you need to know about the evolution of social psychology, I think. What happened as a result of other kinds of things that we got interested in, okay, was that we gave leadership away. And the people that we gave it away to did bad things, is my point. And they gave us back lots of bad things. These are some more cards from zombie leaders. Leadership by spreadsheet, problematic metrics, narcissism, leadership snake oil, and engendering a general sense of kind of hopelessness, if you like. Again, lots of the problems that we're talking about in this conference have at their heart problems of leadership. And every talk I've been to today, I've been thinking to myself, like, where's the leadership dimension to this? If you're talking about prejudice, you can't really talk about prejudice in the world without thinking about leadership. If you're talking about the environment, you've got to talk about leadership. You're talking about inequality, you've got to talk about leadership somewhere along the line. What I want to say is that it is time for us to take that topic back. The world needs us to, okay? So put it back in there and go and do more of this leadership yourselves. We have the knowledge, we have the power. We just now have to mobilize it. I want to end by thanking all of the people who contributed to this, who's I'm trying to channel in this presentation. As I said, leadership and everything that we're interested in is really a kind of an us thing. I started out doing this in 20-point font, and by the time I got a check, I couldn't get any lower than 18-point and have it seen anywhere in the middle of the auditorium. There are many poor people who should be on this list, and if your name's not there, I really apologise. I want to thank George Abdeloff, who wrote the foreword for the book on our behalf, and also Sean Turner, who actually was originally going to be an author on the book and came up with the book's title, but sadly died before we were able to write it. But the book is very much dedicated to him and his ideas and his leadership of us, his identity leadership of us. I spoke to Steve and Michael. I said, I'm going to be talking on behalf of you. Is there anything you really want to say? And they said, well, yeah, blah, 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 we know what we do. But we really want to thank our partners. We want to thank Janet and Diane. So I'm thanking them. And I want to thank Kath for all the leadership she does of me, and I need it. And I want to thank you for being part of this community very much in the way that Sabine said, for having sustained me through an immensely rewarding community. And I come to meetings like this and I'm so invigorated by the energy and excitement and the urgency that you bring to the topics that you do. So I'm asking you to do more followership and more leadership, and I know you will. Thank you very much.